So what I covered in the first part of the evening's entertainment were 14 rather dry maps, some of which are just useful history and some of which actually have some priorities that we might want to consider. The talk that I'm about to give now, I've written this as a separate talk because I didn't want to have a really long talk on the website, but this will be a talk about what we're going to do with these maps. So there were 14 maps that we just looked at. Let me go through briefly each one and tell you whether it's in or out of the prioritization process. Land use is out, as I indicated. That's useful history, but you really can't learn anything about what we should protect from looking at that map. Likewise, topography does not really help us differentiate one part of land from another, although it is interesting. And like John suggested, it might help us decide where to put trails on a piece of land. The soils data map, this was the one that had the underlying soils from the glaciers. There was nothing there to differentiate one part of the town from another either. But agricultural soils, I think there were some types of agricultural soils that we might want to value, and it might go into be one of the things we consider when protecting a piece of land. I grayed out this one, surface waters, watersheds, and FEMA. Not that surface waters are not important, but there's another map coming up that just graphically was easier for me to grab the blue color of the surface waters and identify them as ponds and streams. So that one is out. The flood hazard areas, I happened to gloss over that, but Atkinson is fortunate to not have a lot of flood hazard areas. A lot of other towns have quite a few. And the few that we have are all in wetlands, where we don't have structures anyway. Yeah. And so we're really kind of blessed in that sense. Groundwater and aquifers, I'll say more about why we didn't use the wellhead protection circles, but the aquifers certainly are something we would want to consider. Wetlands, something we would want to consider. Open space is important. We're not going to conserve more open space because we've done that already. But for continuity of spaces, it's good if we can protect areas that are adjacent to or nearly adjacent to open spaces. Wildlife habitat features is a priority that is pretty generally accepted as important. The aerial photo doesn't tell us much. The impervious surface doesn't tell us much, but on that impervious surface map are also the surface waters. And I was able to extract them and build buffers around them, and I'll show you that in a couple of minutes. Unfragmented blocks are certainly important. Forest resource potential didn't really differentiate one part of the town from another. We did not include that, but we did include data from the wildlife corridors and blocks map from the Nature Conservancy. So those were the maps that I'll be going through in a few minutes and show you how we did our analysis. You can't map everything. There are some very important considerations that just cannot be mapped. For example, scenic vistas. Everybody sort of thinks they know what a scenic vista is, but there's no GIS map that says where the scenic vistas are. They're important to consider, but there's just no map for them. Vernal pools. These are very specialized wetlands that are wet in the spring and summer and dry in the fall, and they allow certain species to reproduce in them because there's no fish to eat their eggs. Tadpoles and certain frogs rely on vernal pools to survive because if they were to lay their eggs in a pond that exists 12 months a year, the fishies would come along and eat their eggs. So it's a very important part of the ecosystem. And you really have to put boots on the ground and go look for them. You can't tell a vernal pool from an aerial photograph, so there's no GIS maps of those. There might be things of historic importance that are not on the maps. I'm thinking, that's that structure that's over off Crown Hill that everybody talks about.
Noise shelter?
Oh, the Noise Rock Shelter, yeah. That's not on a map. But at the time that land was protected, it was kind of a big deal that we had this historical thing. Threatened and endangered species of plants and animals. There are maps of those, but they don't share them with the general public, just because they don't want the general public to go out looking for rare and endangered species. So yes, that's to be considered, but it does not appear on any of our maps. And the most important thing of all, the sine qua non, that you cannot do any conservation without, is a willing landowner. The Conservation Commission, I'll speak to the TV camera here, the Conservation Commission does not go forcibly take people's land. We rely upon people who have a value of their land that's more than just dollars and cents, and really interested in protecting that land for future generations of Atkinson residents, and you can't put that on a map. So these are a couple of things that they're very important, but are just not going to appear on the map. So therefore, the following analysis is just one thing to look at when considering a land conservation project. And you don't look at it with a micrometer. So here's the 8 maps that we did include. So I'm going to go through these rather quickly. I have 104 slides here, but they flow pretty quickly. Farmland of statewide importance was something we thought to take a look at. If we go back to that farmland map, the statewide importance farmland is in green. So what we did with the tool here is we selected all of those now in dark green, got rid of everything else. Now you have a layer that's just farmland of statewide importance. Put that on the shelf. Next map is land that's above a stratified drift aquifer. And we go back to this map. Now the reason not to be terribly concerned about the wellhead protection areas, one, I think a lot of them are out of date. They don't really, they cover so much of the town, they don't really differentiate one part from another. And for those of us who are not on one of these public water supplies, like can't get my cursor to work here. I'm up here. Well, no, I'm over here. My backyard is just as important as anybody else's wellhead protection area, because that's my well. So it really didn't make sense to pay attention to those. But we thought that the 2 kinds of stratified drift aquifers shown in dark green and light green were important. So we selected those out as something to protect throughout everything else, and we put that on the shelf. Okay. The next attribute was we wanted to protect land around prime wetlands. We don't want to protect the prime wetlands themselves. They're already protected by state and local zoning. But we want to value the land that's around them as buffers. So here we have the map 7, the wetlands map. The prime wetlands are the ones that are kind of outlined in gold. I don't know why my cursor doesn't work. These things here. So if you take a 300 swath around them, 300-foot swath, throw out everything else, now you've got another layer you can put on the shelf and come back to. These things that are in dark green are all areas that have some attribute about them which we feel is important. Then land within 200 feet of protected land. Again, you don't want to protect land that's already protected, but we do want to favor land that is adjacent to it just for continuity purposes. So of all the lands in town, whoops, hit the wrong button. If you sort out some of the other land, like municipal land, what we have left here in green is town forest land, and yellow is the cluster open space, and the land in gray is privately owned land that has an easement on it. These are protected lands, and if we select 200 feet around each of those, throw out everything else, then those are attributes we would want to consider. From the Wildlife Action Plan by New Hampshire Fish and Game, here's the map that contained both the Merrimack Valley study and the Wildlife Action Plan. There were 3 different tiers of Wildlife Action Plan land, pink, green, and orange. We considered those of equal importance, and so selected those out for protection, throw away everything else, and then that gets stored. For protecting buffers around streams and ponds, we chose a 100-foot buffer, and this is now the impervious surfaces map that I mentioned. And it's pretty clear where the streams are here. And if we just do a 100-foot buffer around them, that's that. Okay, so that gets stored away. Map 12 was the unfragmented blocks map. We considered each of these to be equally important. Size did not matter to us, so selected all of those areas, threw away everything else, and put that on the shelf. And finally, coming down to the Nature Conservancy and Southeast Land Trust Wildlife Corridor Study, we considered both the corridors and the other areas, the habitat areas, to be important, selected those out, got rid of everything else. So now what you have is 8 different layers of different attributes. And if you throw all of those in the same bucket, that's what you get. Not terribly useful, because you can't see through these layers. So if you go back to the individual layers and make them semi-transparent, they now show up as very light green on the graphic. Then if we start layering these things in one at a time, if we take, this is the farmland of statewide importance, if you layer on top of that, above a stratified drift aquifer, and lay on top of that land that's within 100 feet of or 300 feet of a prime wetland, you can now begin to see there's different shades of green showing up here. Layer in within 200 feet of protected land, then add the Wildlife Action Plan habitat areas, add 100 feet around all the streams and ponds, add in the unfragmented blocks, and layer in again the wildlife corridors. Now you can see that there's some differentiation in shades of green. My problem is, I mentioned I'm having cataract surgery. I can't really tell the difference between some of these shades of green, but the computer can. And so we first tried to suggest this color scheme to the Rockingham Planning Commission. It seems there is a convention for the colors that should be used on these maps, and they go from cool to warm. Cool being not too many attributes, warm being a lot. So using the ability of the computer to differentiate colors, we took any area of the lightest green that has only one attribute and made it that ugly color. The next shade of green, which contained 2 attributes, was sort of a mustardy color. 3 attributes begins to get orange. 4 attributes is a brighter orange. 5 attributes is almost red, and 6 and more is really, really bright red. Now you can see where these things line up, and this then begins to tell us these are areas that have some documented GIS mappable features that we would want to try to protect. But we don't want to protect land that's already protected. So I threw in another layer of land that's already conserved in gray. So we don't look at that. We look at the stuff that's around it.
Is it already, sorry, it's already, this might be
the
your
gray
slide.
is already conserved. It's
By us?
By either the town owns it, or it's dedicated open space, or it's land that an individual landowner has that has an easement on it.
Or prime wetlands?
No, the prime wetlands are those.
Got it, okay.
Which you know, we don't own all the prime wetlands, but they're still protected.
Yep.
So those are the things that we don't
They're
really.
protected by zoning, but not by permanent easement documents.
That's true. That's true, yeah.
So that's something to keep in mind.
They're protected by the state too.
To a degree, but not
Laws,
to the same degree.
laws and zoning can always change.
Right, Atkinson does a better job of protecting them than the state does.
Yeah,
So.
because they don't come look at them very often.
Well, they only have what's their buffer is 100?
Yeah, 100
100
feet. 100 feet, yeah. Anyway, so that is the Natural Resource Priority Area Map, also known as Map 15. I just gave you kind of a moving picture show of how that was developed. Let me give you an example of how to use it. When we were working for a while with Teresa Walker at the Rockingham Planning Commission after Julie had left, Teresa doesn't know the town very well, but she suggested, well, why don't you have a table in the report that looks at these areas that are labeled A through M. And she just picked the areas not knowing much about where they were. It's interesting that one of the areas she picked is your land.
Oh, really?
It's E on here. And that table in the report looks like this, and every X, let's see, the columns in this table are the different areas of town, the rows are different attributes. And every place you see an X, it means that piece of land has that attribute. To give you an idea of how these were produced, if you look at area L, which is, get my cursor to behave, this area up here, if I zoom in on that, area L, you can see it's sort of to the east of Maple Avenue. So to analyze what's there, the first thing we might want to do is look at that aerial photograph. And we see, yeah, it's next to what is the east side of the Sawmill Swamp right there. That's good. Let's look at some of the other attributes. Let's look at topography. There's nothing particular sticking out about that area. It's all pretty flat in that area. Let's look at the agricultural soils. Those of statewide importance, those with the green in this map. Yeah, if the parcel, depending on the size and shape of the parcel, yeah, it might contain some of those soils. So that would be worthy of protection. If we look at the stratified drift aquifer data, no, it's not near one of those. It does abut a prime wetland, as we figured out already. It's not close to land, it's not within 200 feet of any land that's already protected, so it does not contain that attribute. It is adjacent to or perhaps contains some of the important areas from the Fish and Game Wildlife Action Plan. You'll notice there's no, I did not put tax lines on these maps. The report does not contain tax lines because we don't want to talk about individual people's land. The only time we talk about individual people's land is if they are interested in working with us. Then we'll pull out a tax map later and we'll do that. But the plan does not contain tax maps on tax lines on purpose. It's about general areas of town. We're not targeting people's land. Just mention that as a caveat because I know it's going to come up. L is part of an unfragmented block, and it contains some of the forest soils which did not show up as part of the prioritization project, but it may be important in applying for grants depending on what a grant might value. And it looks like it does at least partly contain a wildlife corridor, theoretical wildlife corridor. So that's where that column of this table came up with. Bill and I arduously sat in my studio one Saturday morning going through all of these maps and building this table. It's just an example of how to use the analysis that was done. So looking back then at the co-occurrence map, the colors do indicate that there were quite a number of areas of attributes of importance in this area. So I believe that's the end of the show. It is. A word to our sponsors, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Paul. That was awesome.
Great
job.
Thank you.
Thank you for the hard work.
Very good.